Bonjour les amis. Hello my dear students. Welcome to FLCC. I am Lalit Rao, your presenter and French teacher. Today's video is going to be interesting because in today's video I am going to talk to you about the 17th century French literature. 17th century French literature was a period of intense literary production which saw three major literary currents. They are le Baroque, la Préciosité et le Burlesque and le Classicisme. In literature, Baroque is characterized by variety and a freedom of forms. La Préciosité involved women of the high society who would meet in different salons to comment upon the literature and write poetry and novels. Finally, Classicism is defined as a cultural and artistic movement whose works have achieved the status of a model. Classical authors sought to imitate ancient authors such as Sophocles or Euripides, whom they considered to be models. So, ladies and gentlemen, and my dear friends, my dear students, this was a brief introduction to 17th century French literature. Now I will talk about 10 major writers of the 17th century French literature. Blaise Pascal is our first writer about whom I am going to speak. Blaise Pascal was born in 1623 and he died in 1662. One of the great advocates of Christian ideas, Blaise Pascal was a French mathematician, scientist and a literary stylist. His contributions to theoretical and empirical sciences were influential. Pascal's name is inseparably associated with Jansenism, a religious movement which inspired much of the literature of his time. Blaise Pascal was born on 19 June 1623 in Clermont-Ferrand. At 12 years of age, Pascal secretly learned geometry all alone. Among the major works by Pascal, one can cite Les Provinciales, 1656 to 1657, a collection of 18 philosophical letters, Pensées, 1657 until 1667, philosophical and religious texts divided into 27 sections. They were published posthumously in 1670. In the Pensées, Pascal set out to justify Christianity within the reigning Enlightenment spirit of doubt. He divided human reason into two varieties, spirit of geometry and spirit of finesse. Pascal's wager is the argument which Blaise Pascal propounded for belief in God. He died of cancer in 1662 at the age of 39 in Port-Royal. Now I move on to our second writer, François Fénelon, who was born in 1651 and who died in 1715. François de Salimien de la Motte was a French clergyman and mystic whose extensive writings displayed a versatile talent as educationist, storyteller and constitutional theorist. His banishment from the court of Louis XIV transformed into an epitome of dignified political exile. In 1687, Fénelon wrote the Traité de l'éducation des filles. In 1699, he wrote Les Aventures de Télémaque, the famous pedagogical novel based on the fusion of classical narrative with moral, indeed constitutional lessons. Fénelon is remembered in the realm of the French literature as the precursor of the philosophical novel. Fénelon's dependence and quietism earned the censure of Bossuet, the biggest orator of the 17th century. It relegated him to his diocese. Now I move on to the third writer, Honoré d'Urfé, who was born in 1567 and who died in 1625. Honoré d'Urfé was a French novelist poet and moralist whose first success was a pastoral poem Sirine, published in 1604. He was the inventor of foppish novel cycle Romo Fleur. Honoré D'Urfé was a nobleman by birth, half Italian, half French. From his childhood, he was immersed into the cultural environment of Italian Renaissance. He acquired vast culture by embracing the classics, the writings of the Italian philosophers Marsilio Ficino and Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, and Italian and Spanish literature. His most famous work, Lastre, was published between 1607 to 1627 and was widely seen as the culmination of the pastoral tradition in France. Lastre is a treatise on sentimental education and a sum of the process of reasoning. Honoré D'Urfé spent the rest of his life in Italy, principally concerned with Lastre, a literary work which brought him European acclaim. Now I move on to the fourth writer of the 17th century, fourth important writer of the 17th century, Jean Racine, who was born in 1639 and who died in 1699. Racine was a French tragic playwright. Two dominant influences in his life combined to produce his great tragedy of passion. They were his Jansenist education and sympathetic knowledge of the Greek drama. He was born in La Ferté-Milon in a middle-class family. Racine was orphaned while still a small child. He was sent to Port-Royal des Champs. His plays were compared with those of Corneille. It was said by the classical moralist Jean de la Bruyère that Pierre Corneille depicted people as they should be, but Jean Racine depicted them as they are. Racine's first compositions consisted of flattering odes on the marriage of Louis XIV and the like. He wrote those odes to obtain a royal pension. Although Racine was criticized by Stendhal in the book Racine et Shakespeare, he continues to be acted, read, praised and interpreted in France and other countries. Jean Racine's famous plays include Andromaque 1667, Berenice 1671, Iphigenie 1674, Britannicus 1669, Bajazet 1672 and Phèdre 1677. Now I move on to the next writer, the great French fable writer Jean de La Fontaine. Writer of the fables Jean de La Fontaine, who was born in 1621 and who died in 1695. Jean de La Fontaine was born in Château-Thierry. He was the moralist of the classic century. As a contemporary of Molière, La Rochefoucauld and La Bruyère, La Fontaine is known as the creator of the French fable. It is under his influence that fable became a truly poetic genre in the 17th century. La Fontaine's most famous work, Fable, 1668 until 1694, is a collection of 12 books. La Fontaine's major fables are La cigale et la fourmi, Le corbeau et le renard, Le loup et le chien, Le lièvre et la tortue, Les deux pigeons, Les animaux malades de la peste. La Fontaine was destined for the priesthood, but his easygoing nature led him instead to Paris. The fables, which began to appear a few years later, are compact animal fables in the tradition of the Greek fabulist Aesop, written with verve, delicacy and delightful humor. La Fontaine's literary tastes range from Plato to Rabelais, and his writings show a love of experiment as well as a sensitivity to contemporary taste. In Jean de La Fontaine's fable, one can find a didactic range. For example, et toi le ciel t'aidera, and il ne faut jamais vendre la peau de l'ours avant de l'avoir tué. Ladies and gentlemen, my dear friends and my dear students, it's time for me to talk about a woman writer, Madame de Lafayette, who was born in 1634 and who died in 1693. Marie-Madeleine Pioche de Lavenne entered the literary scene during the golden age of the salons. Madame de Lafayette's first published work was a verbal portrait of her lifelong closest friend, Madame de Sévigné. Madame de Lafayette is famous for a series of historical novels. They are La Princesse de Montpensier, 1662, Zaide, 1670, and La Princesse de Clèves, 1678. La Princesse de Clèves, 1678, ensured Madame de Lafayette's place in the realm of French literature. It talks about its heroine's overwhelming passion for an outsider from the point of view of its effects on her otherwise successful marriage. It was translated into English in 1679. Madame de Lafayette is considered to be a mysterious woman of letters, as the works attributed to her have never been signed in her name. She is remembered for initiating a big debate on the novel. The groundwork for theoretical research was set up by her, which interests all writers. This debate talked about social status of the novel, literary personality of a writer, function of the novel, and the writing technique. Now it's time for me to talk about one of the greatest figures of the French literature. Ladies and gentlemen, my dear friends and my dear students, I'm talking to you about Molière, who was born in 1622 and who died in 1673. Jean-Baptiste Poquelin is considered to be a major symbol of French culture. Molière, with La Fontaine and Victor Hugo, is one of the three major authors of the French literature who is universally acclaimed. Molière possessed an unrivaled knowledge of the French society in the second half of the 17th century. He was able to leave a comprehensive gallery of different portraits and different types. In 1643, Molière became one of the founders of a company of actors calling themselves L'Illustre Théâtre. This venture was not successful. After failures and creditors on their back, the company took to the provinces. In 1664, an important satire on religious hypocrisy, Tartuffe appeared. It was violently attacked by religious groups as a burlesque on piety. The tacit support of the king was not even sufficient to quell the opposition. On 17 February 1673, Molière died after the fourth performance of Le Malade Imaginaire. Molière's famous plays include Don Juan, 1665, La Misanthrope, 1666, Tartuffe, 1669, Les Femmes Savantes, 1672, Le Malade Imaginaire, 1673, Le Bourgeois Gentilhomme, 1670, Les Fourberies de Scapin, 1671, L'Avare, 1668, L'École des Femmes, 1662, Les Précieuses Ridicules, 1659. Now I move on to the next writer, Nicolas Boileau, who was born in 1636 and who died in 1711. A formalist poet as well as a satirical writer, Nicolas Boileau can be considered the theoretician of classicism in France. Boileau's most famous work is Art Poétique, published in 1674. It is a didactic poem divided into 4 songs. An outspoken and often bitter man, Boileau was the model for Alceste in Moliere's Le Misanthrope. He made many enemies, including people from precious circles and the writers mentioned by the statesman Jean-Baptiste Colbert. Boileau codified classical rules in art poetique under the form of a big discourse in Alexandrine, where he enumerates the principles of the art of writing. Art poetique was inspired by poetics written by the great Greek philosopher Aristotle. Boileau actively participated in the row of Ancien and Moderne, the big debate of ideas that divided the end of 17th century in France. Boileau is also remembered for his contribution to disseminate great theatrical works of Corneille and Racine. Now, I am going to talk to you about Pierre Corneille, an important writer of the French literature of the 17th century. Pierre Corneille was born in 1606 and he died in 1684. French dramatist Pierre Corneille was born in Rouen in a family of magistrates. He was educated at a Jesuit school. Voltaire called him the father of theatre. He was the founder of classical theatre and wrote 32 plays. In the 17th century France, obedience to the rules of classical drama was the norm, with careful adherence to the three unities, namely unity of action, unity of place and unity of time. It was Corneille who helped to re-establish this restriction. He emphasized the study of psychological crisis with its conflict of human values. Corneille achieved the beginning of his real fame with the first of his tragedies, Le Cid, based on Spanish dramas about a national hero. This was a typical Corneille play with the theme of conflict between honor and love. In his attitude to the theatre, Corneille was proudly independent. He did not accept the authority of Aristotle and his interpreters on all points. Only a small part of Corneille's oeuvre is now familiar to the broad public, and generalizations about the Cornelian tragedy are based solely on a handful of his plays. Among Corneille's famous plays, we can cite L'Illusion Comique 1636, Le Cid 1637, Horace 1640, Cinna 1641, Polyeucte 1643. Ladies and gentlemen, now it's time for me to talk to you about the last writer, René Descartes, and after having talked about him, I'm going to show you the photos of all these 10 great writers. So, stay connected. René Descartes was born in 1596 and he died in 1650. René Descartes was the French philosopher, scientist and mathematician whose application of mathematical principles to philosophical problems laid the groundwork for rationalism and the scientific method. Descartes was born in La Haye in Touraine and educated at the Jesuit College of La Flèche. In 1629, having decided to devote himself to philosophy, he settled in Holland, where he lived for the rest of his life. Discours de la Méthode was Descartes' first published book. It was published in 1637 together with essays on optics, meteorology and geometry. It is a complex work whose 6 parts are given unity as the story of the author's search for truth. The Méditation is Descartes' most important work of pure philosophy. Using the first-person form, it attempts to establish firmly the metaphysics of the discourse, especially the existence of God and mind-matter distinction. His last work, Les Passions de l'âme, was written at the request of Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia. It explained the passions according to his dualistic principle. René Descartes is generally regarded as the founder of modern philosophy. His major philosophical works are Discours de la méthode 1637, Méditation métaphysique 1641 and Traité des passions de l'âme 1649. Now ladies and gentlemen, it's time for me to show you the photos of these 10 great writers. So